You're sitting there watching a horror movie, and then you're screaming at the screen, "Don't go in there, you idiot!" But then you realize, this isn't a horror movie, this is a game, and I'm the one that's gotta go in there. I can't not go in there, I just spent $20 on this game. I'm the idiot. The horror genre is probably my favorite genre, probably because of the different stories, the settings, and the general atmosphere it can invoke. That and who doesn't love a good scare? But at the same time, it's also the genre oversaturated with the most crap. Same thing can be said about horror games, with the only exception being mobile games. Regarding the thing I said earlier about who doesn't like a good scare and horror being my favorite genre, horror movies really don't scare me all that much. But that's okay, horror doesn't mean scary. I don't have to be scared by a horror movie because I can still be engaged by the other elements of it. Sometimes it could be the story or just the overall feeling the movie gives off. Or maybe I just want to watch somebody get their head punched off. With that being said, where horror movies fail, horror games succeed. Horror games usually scare the crap out of me. But why? So why do horror games do this when horror films don't? Well, that's simple. In a horror game, you're what's for dinner. That psycho killer with an axe, he's not chasing some random group of teenagers. No, he's chasing you. That ghost that's haunting a house, yeah, no, Zach Baggins isn't going in there to save the day. No, that's you. You gotta go deal with that ghost. For me, horror games invoke the ultimate sense of immersion compared to other games. Whether it's descending Castle Brandenburg, or exploring the town of Silent Hill, or investigating the Raccoon City Police Department, you're usually immersed in whatever horror game you find yourself playing. I'm not saying you can't be immersed in other games, horror just seems to pull me in quicker than most other genres do. The same thing with horror films applies to horror games. A horror game does not have to scare me for me to enjoy it. Well, yes, I do enjoy the adrenaline rush you get from a good scare. What really pulls me into a horror game is that sense of dread and immersion that you can't really get anywhere else. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is usually held as the king of horror games. It kind of redefined the genre, and it ushered in a whole era of Let's Players and channels on YouTube. Well, what was so special about Amnesia compared to other games at the time? Amnesia drops you in an unfamiliar place and hardly gives you any explanation of what's happening, and the only way you can figure it out is by progressing through the dark halls of the castle. Along the way, you have to solve puzzles, and eventually you start running into monsters. Most games would probably give you a weapon or some way to fend against the threat pursuing you, but Amnesia said,
"Better get running, bitch."
On top of having to face an unbeatable threat, the game also throws a sanity meter at you. The longer you stay in darkness or look at monsters, the worse your sanity gets. It's a neat mechanic that constantly keeps you on edge to make sure that you've always got enough tinder boxes or oil in your lantern. But funny enough, the worst thing that the sanity meter would actually do is basically just give the player drunk vision. But it was the illusion of having your sanity drop that would lead to something bad happening that kept players on edge at all times. It's that kind of thing that made it much more immersive than any other thing at the time. That and the setting of Brandenburg Castle is just great. You have these dark, spooky hallways you go down, and then all of a sudden it opens up into a big, bright, open room, and it lures you into a false sense of security, because the moment you go into the next room, you just get jumped by a monster. I heard that the developers recently added in a hard mode that actually does invoke consequences for having your sanity drop. I'm not going to play it. I've played Amnesia enough, but I give the creators props for going in and adding that in almost a decade later. Atmosphere. See, one of the biggest things I like about the horror genre in horror games is just the atmosphere they invoke. And I think Silent Hill is probably the best at this. The entire town's engulfed in this thick fog that's always looming over the player. The fog was originally put in because the hardware at the time couldn't render the entire level at once, so they put this fog in to hide this issue, and it worked hugely in the game's favor. I'm mainly going to talk about Silent Hill 2 because it's held as the best in the series, and it's also my personal favorite. So the game takes place in the fictional town of Silent Hill, and the main character gets a letter from his wife telling you to come find her. The only problem is she's been dead for 3 years. The game gives time to let the dread set in and build the atmosphere as you have to walk a while through the woods to get into town. And as soon as you get into town, you can just tell something isn't right. No one's to be seen, and there's monsters roaming around. Unlike Amnesia, though, you can defend yourself, but the combat is incredibly clunky. I could get past this, though, as the main focus of the game isn't about you being a badass monster hunter. It's about exploring the town and trying to piece everything together and find out what happened with your wife. Silent Hill 2 has some of my favorite settings in a game. I love the hotel where you have to search all the rooms in the dark hallways while dealing with monsters. The game does an excellent job at setting an uneasy tone while continuously having the player push forward. Also, the designs of the monsters being symbolic for the main character's emotional trauma and psychological desires was a really creative idea. With all that being said though, by today's standards, I wouldn't consider Silent Hill 2 a scary game. Yes, it is unsettling, but I wouldn't consider it scary when compared to other horror games I've played. Despite that, Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite horror games with how it creates a disturbing atmosphere and the story it tells through its environment and the few encounters you have with other people. I like the slow burn of the game as you go through different parts of the town collecting different items. You find yourself spending a lot of time in the same locations just exploring every room and back alley, and that helps familiarize you with the town of Silent Hill. It kind of makes it its own character. Also, the soundtrack kicks ass. Seriously, it's probably my favorite video game soundtrack. I'd highly recommend you play this game if you haven't. Don't play the remastered version though, because they butchered a lot of stuff from the original version in it. I could keep pulling up different horror games as examples and say what I liked about them, but the overall thing that I'm getting at is that horror games seem to do the best job of pulling me into them, getting a reaction out of me. Yes, sometimes that reaction is a cheap jump scare. Horror films aren't the only ones guilty of this, but what really stands out with me with horror games is the build-up. Those first moments of, where am I? Why am I here? And what do I have to be worried about? And as you're exploring the environment, your mind's just playing games on you. You're just trying to piece together what's lurking around and waiting to pounce on you. And it can just leave you on edge, just waiting for something to happen. I have a video where I played a horror game where nothing actually happens at all the entire time in the horror game, but I'm so on edge the entire video just waiting for something to happen to where I actually end up jumping whenever the game would just hard cut to a different point in the level. While yes, it was cheap that overall nothing happened in the game and that it was just a walking simulator, just the overall sense of dread and suspense I had was something I don't really get from other media. And speaking of walking simulators and nothing happening, let me get to my next example. Layers of Fear initially has you start off in a similar situation like Amnesia, to where you're just exploring a dark place trying to figure out what's happening. Where Amnesia succeeds and Layers of Fear fails is the payoff. See, while exploring in Amnesia, you're on edge just wondering what's lurking in the dark. You actually don't encounter anything for a good while. Eventually though, you do finally come across monsters and then you're just always on edge just trying to avoid them for the rest of the game. And it just adds to the overall suspense and dread you can feel in a horror game. Layers of Fear also has you explore, but after a while you kind of begin to notice that there's really nothing happening in the house. Yeah, there's pre-scripted events and all, but overall there's really nothing out to get you. You're just playing a walking simulator. And this kind of just diminishes all the tension in the game. The issue with Layers of Fear is that it over-relies on psychological horror, which can work if done right. Okay, I can't go and criticize Layers of Fear when PT did basically the exact same thing. But why did PT succeed with it and Layers of Fear failed? Remember, these are just my opinions, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. I think length has a lot to do with it. See, the more you play Layers of Fear, the less tense it gets because you're just walking around for 3 hours and that just diminishes all the tension in it. Nothing really happens in it besides pre-scripted jump scares and occasional dialogue you hear in the main character's head. So this just goes on for too long and the horror really wears off. PT, on the other hand, was about 20 to 40 minutes long depending on how you played it, and it has scripted events in it like Layers of Fear, but PT's short length plays in its favor. It hits you with the right amount of scares in just the right amount of time, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. That, and I just feel like PT just gave off a creepier atmosphere to it than Layers of Fear. You've got things like a crying fetus in the sink or a bloody fridge hanging from the ceiling, and let's not forget about Lisa, the ghost. You have plenty of scripted encounters with Lisa, but at the same time you have random encounters with her too, so you're always on edge just wondering if you're just gonna pull the corner and she's just gonna be waiting for you. Not to mention they prove that she's always following you. She's always right behind the player, so that's a very comforting thought to have. So yeah, PT kind of had like the perfect blend of elements in it, and it's probably the best you could get with being a strictly psychological horror game. But here's the thing about PT. PT was just a teaser for Silent Hills. Sadly, Silent Hills got canceled by Konami because Konami are a bunch of idiots nowadays. While PT did the whole psychological horror walking simulator thing perfectly. Do you really think Silent Hills would have been a full-fledged walking simulator? Probably not. Yes, I know Kojima made Death Stranding, and Death Stranding is also a walking simulator, but at the same time you had the elements of you could avoid the BTs, or you could engage in combat with them. So it wasn't just walking around waiting for pre-scripted events to happen. PT worked just because it was a teaser. You know, it was just a free half-hour teaser, and it got everybody spooked and hyped for Silent Hills. Layers of Fear, on the other hand, was a multi-hour finished title that you'd pay $20 for, and psychological horror can only carry you for so long. Like I said, these are just my opinions. You're free to like whatever you want. I'll give Layers of Fear props for its initial build-up. It just overstays its welcome. If you want me to be engaged in your game for this long, you gotta spice it up. You can't rely just on your psychological horror. The Shining's a great example of this. Like, yeah, the Overlook Hotel's spooky, the ghosts are creepy, but at the end of the day, everybody's on the edge of their seats because Jack Nicholson is chasing people around with an axe. I guess I just wanted to make this video to share my feelings and thoughts about horror games. Yes, there's a whole bunch of crappy ones out there, and honestly, I do enjoy them. I like trash. But there are also those real gems that stand out and have an ability to immerse you better than most other forms of media out there, and I think that's why horror games are so special to me.